Hello again. Good morning from southeastern Finland in northern Europe. Yesterday, on July the 14th, 2019, was the 230th anniversary. I have to make that correction then later to the video's title of the start of the French Revolution. In, for example, the Finnish historiography, it is actually called the Great French Revolution because there have been several other regime changes or revolutions in the French history. One could even argue that the establishment of the First French Republic on September the 22nd, 1792, which also marked the starting date of the so-called French Revolutionary calendar, which existed officially for over 13 years until Napoleon, the first French emperor and military dictator, simply abandoned it on January the 1st, 1806. That could have been a minor revolution inside the revolution. Or the king's destitution or dethronement, which had preceded the First French Republic's establishment by over 1 month. That had happened on August the 10th, 1792. Then we could also argue that the overthrow of probably the most radical French revolutionary leader, Mr. Maximilien Robespierre, and his execution alongside over 20 of his followers on July the 28th, 1794, if I remember the date correctly, that could have been a minor revolution inside the revolution, because then it was followed by the so-called directorate or directory, a more moderate revolutionary regime where there were 5 directors or political leaders of France appointed by the French Parliament, and then their powers were so strictly divided as to prevent any of them from becoming a dictator. This goal was actually reached. Unfortunately, since they could not agree sufficiently on the policies to be pursued in order to preserve the revolution's ideals, at least for the French adult men who were the country's citizens, namely liberty, freedom, fraternity, or brotherhood and equality. So having officially the same legal rights. This led to unstable governments, the annulment or rigging of at least one French parliamentary election, and then eventually to the military coup, officially a bloodless coup of November 1799, so over 10 years after the Great French Revolution had started, when Napoleon Bonaparte, at the time a 30-year-old, mostly successful French general, overthrew the directorate and established, in essence, a military dictatorship. Although he disguised it in the form of a hastily prepared constitution, which made him the first consul and gave him the right to appoint 2 advisors called the second consul and the third consul. However, he was not bound by their advice, nor was he bound by the French Parliament's decisions already, because of the fact that he could ultimately pick and choose their members from the lists of potential parliamentarians, nor was he bound much by the laws, despite the fact that France still had, much like the Roman Empire, between 27 before Christ and 180 AD, the superficial appearance of a limited regime. But in fact, the Roman Empire was, for much of those over 200 years, an autocracy, especially if the emperor was strong enough and had the support of the army and the bureaucracy, especially of their highest echelons. And France was basically an autocracy, although one disguised as a revolution or a post-revolution or a moderate revolutionary regime. And then, as we know from our reading of history and from historical documentaries, videos, and films, after his disastrous defeats in Russia between especially September and November 1812, and then in Leipzig in 1813, eventually Napoleon agreed to abdicate in March or April 1814, which led to the Bourbon monarchy's restoration under King Louis XVIII, who was a surviving brother of the executed and before that destituted or deposed King Louis XVI. This restoration lasted only about 11 months because in March 1815, Napoleon, who had been made the prince of a small island off the northwestern coast of Italy, Elba, escaped from the island and proclaimed himself emperor again, starting the so-called 100 Days Empire, which ended with Napoleon's disastrous and decisive defeat in Waterloo, now Belgium, in June 1815. And after that, he was imprisoned and sent to the southern Atlantic island of St. Helena, where he died under somewhat suspicious circumstances, officially of stomach cancer, but possibly due to a short or a longer-term poisoning or slow poisoning in May 1821. The restored Bourbon monarchy made some changes. France again became a largely autocratic, or at least authoritarian, and certainly oligarchic kingdom, where rather few men could vote because the property requirement became so high. However, the Roman Catholic Church did not become the state church again. It was only recognized as the majority national church. And then Louis XVIII died in 1824 and was succeeded by his basically autocratic, or at least pro-autocracy brother, Charles X, whose autocratic tendencies eventually led to the July 1830 revolution, which brought Louis Philippe to power, and the so-called July monarchy was slightly or somewhat more democratic than the preceding regime, however, far from the modern democracy. The right to vote was still limited, and in the 1840s, King Louis Philippe and his chief minister, officially, I think, education minister, François Guizot, limited, for example, the freedoms of speech, the press, and assembly, leading to the February 1848 revolution, which brought a Republican government to power for the first time in practice. All male citizens of France who were legally adults could vote. The moderate Republicans won the parliamentary elections, and then in December 1848, Louis Bonaparte, who was Napoleon's nephew, was elected the first French president by almost 3/4 of the votes. He abided by the Constitution's terms officially for 3 years, and then he staged a coup in December 1851 because he did not like having to share his power with the parliament. And he wanted to remain in power for the rest of his life. The regime became an autocratic or authoritarian republic. The president was to serve a 10-year term, and the legislature was made into a bicameral one. The Senate prepared the laws, and the Assembly discussed and voted on them. In December 1852, he proclaimed the Second French Republic after another plebiscite or referendum claimed that a great majority of the participating French male voters wanted a second empire. This empire lasted over 17 years until France's disastrous military defeat in Sedan to the Prussian-led German forces in September 1870. And then this was followed by Paris' siege and the eventual proclamation. Then there was the Paris Commune, a brief regime in the spring of 1871, and eventually the Third French Republic was proclaimed, which became, over the 69 years of its existence, gradually a parliamentary republic. Theoretically, the president had some important powers, such as the right to nominate the prime minister or the head of government. And then, of course, he also had the right to dissolve and call early elections for the Chamber of Deputies, the French Parliament's lower house. However, after this right's controversial use, or rather abuse, by President Patrice MacMahon in 1877, it was no longer used. And this regime lasted for about 69 years until the French military defeat to Germany in June 1940, which led to the occupation of 3/5 of the mainland France, and then the so-called French state, l'État français, also called the Vichy regime, because its capital was Vichy in southeastern France. It was an authoritarian regime with limited civil rights and freedoms, and the aged Marshal Philippe Pétain as its titular head of state. And then this regime eventually fell in August 1944, which led then first to the establishment of an interim government led by General Charles de Gaulle, who had led the Free French Forces, les Forces Françaises Libres. And then he resigned in January 1946 because he did not want another parliamentary republic. And then through 2 referendums, the Fourth French Republic was established by the autumn of 1946. It was another parliamentary republic with a largely ceremonial president, as the head of state, and the prime minister, who theoretically was supposed to be a more powerful political leader than the president, serving as the head of government. But this was only theory, because the governments kept falling just about as frequently, if not even more frequently, than those of the Third French Republic. This led to a severe political crisis, especially because Algeria, geographically the largest French colony in Africa, was starting its revolt, which would end in its independence in 1962. And General de Gaulle was recalled into office and installed as the new French prime minister on June the 1st, 1958. With some or several of his advisors, he prepared a semi-presidential constitutional draft, which then was approved by a referendum, if I remember correctly, in September or then October 1958. Some 79% of the French voters who cast valid votes approved of this new regime in the name of political stability. In November 1958, l'Union pour la Nouvelle République, the New Republic's Union, which was a political alliance or party created by de Gaulle's supporters, won the elections, parliamentary elections, and with certain supporting parties or coalitions, Michel Debré was able to form a new Gaullist French government as its prime minister in January 1959. In December 1958, Charles de Gaulle had been formally elected president by a huge majority in the electoral college that had 80,000 members, and he took office as the first president of the Fifth French Republic in January 1959. And that regime, over 60 years later, is still in force, although plagued, like many other, if not most other Western democracies, by an increasingly cynical and apathetic electorate, and then rising extremism. On the basis of the May 2019 European Parliamentary election results in France, there are basically only two fairly large political parties or coalitions left. The coalition based around the current French president, Emmanuel Macron, whose political party is called La République en Marche, the Republic on the March, and then the national rally or coalition, however it should be translated, Le Rassemblement National, or the national movement, maybe, yes. A far-right party or coalition led by a three-time presidential candidate, Miss Marine Le Pen. The traditional parties, the center-right party Les Républicains, the Republicans, and the center-left Socialist Party failed miserably in those elections. Well, we know, or at least should know, the basic timeline of the Great French Revolution. On July the 14th, 1789, a mob of Parisians stormed the controversial and hated royal prison, Bastille, which later was then broken down. The first victims of the Great French Revolution were those guards who were killed, and then the commander, Delaunay, who was first abused and kicked by the crowd and then beaten to death. Then on July the 17th, 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate, so mostly upper middle class lawyers and other parliamentarians, and those liberal or reform-minded aristocrats and clergymen who decided to join them, proclaimed themselves the French National Assembly under the so-called tennis court oath. At first, King Louis XVI tried to resist the creation of this assembly because the Estates General included 3 estates: the First Estate, the Second Estate, and the Third Estate. And since they voted each estate by themselves, the first 2 estates could always outvote the third. But eventually he had to agree to recognize the French National Assembly and then voting by representative. And this led eventually, well, this led in August 1789 to the proclamation of the rights of the man and citizen, which established a set of rights and freedoms enjoyed especially by the French male citizens. And then the king had to agree to share his power with the National Assembly and then the cabinet. This was formalized by the 1791 Constitution, which attempted to establish a parliamentary and limited monarchy. But because Louis XVI only half-heartedly supported this order, he eventually was arrested and deposed in August 1792. The First French Republic was officially proclaimed in September 1792, and the king was then brought under trial in or around December 1792 or January 1793. And as we know, he was condemned to death, for example, for conspiring with certain European monarchies to overthrow the new revolution of France. This was true to the extent that he had some correspondence arranged by a Swedish middleman, Count Axel von Fersen, and indeed he did not like the anti-Catholic and anti-clerical rhetoric of especially radical revolutionaries. He preferred the old regime's re-establishment, but he was unsure by which means it could be established. To put a long story short, he was condemned to death and then executed by guillotine on January the 21st, 1793. Almost exactly 9 months later, his widow, La Veuve Capet, the widow of Capet, because the French dynasty could be traced back to, of course, with various or many changes, to Hugo Capet, who had become the French king in the late 10th century AD. Marie Antoinette, who was born an Austrian princess, and whose one of whose brothers, Leopold, if I remember correctly, or then, yeah, 2 of whose brothers had served as Austrian emperors, and who certainly disliked the new revolutionary regime. She was condemned to death and also guillotined. The Committee of Public Safety was formed, led by an extremely radical French revolutionary activist, the lawyer Maximilien Robespierre, and eventually it became so rabid in its search for anti-revolutionaries that it began to suspect almost anyone of harboring, for example, defeatist sentiments. So fearing or expecting that the revolutionary France would eventually lose to its more conservative military opponents in Europe. During the Reign of Terror, an estimated between 16,000 and 40,000 people inside France were put to death. Ironically, most of them belonged not to the nobles or aristocrats or the clergy, but to members of the former Third Estate. So in that sense, it could be said that the Great French Revolution ate many of its children. Many of the people whose rights and freedoms the new revolutionary regime was to actually establish and enshrine in the constitution, because they were accused of having anti-republican sentiments, and ultimately even the suspicion of those revolutionary courts was sufficient to condemn a person to death. In November 1793, the so-called cult or worship of reason was established in Paris with the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Our Lady, meaning, of course, Virgin Mary in the Roman Catholic theology, being proclaimed the temple of reason, and a Parisian female dancer being worshipped as the symbol of the goddess of reason. Since this new atheistic worship of reason proved too controversial, and especially many rural French people strongly objected to it, Maximilien Robespierre instituted a more moderate religious cult called the Cult of the Supreme Being, which fitted well with the Enlightenment ideals of deism and religious tolerance. That was instituted in June 1794, in early June, I think. But then on July the 27th, 1794, Robespierre and over 20 of his assistants, close allies, were arrested by those more moderate French revolutionaries who were afraid of being killed should Robespierre be allowed to govern France and institute his mystical Republic of Virtue, which would contain no anti-revolutionary people. And then the following day, Robespierre, who had been badly wounded in the jaw, he had either tried to commit suicide by shooting himself with a pistol, or then while being arrested, he had accidentally shot himself without intending to kill himself. He was badly wounded, but executed the following day, along with those over 20 fellow radical revolutionaries who had been found. And then this established the Directorate, which held power for over 5 years until it was overthrown by Napoleon Bonaparte, a young and rather successful general who claimed to be a child of the revolution. Well, the revolution did allow him to become an army officer so early, and a general already at age 24. The French Revolution ended up benefiting especially the upper middle classes, and particularly the lawyers. It was a strongly male-dominated movement. Indeed, Olympe de Gouges, who was a French woman of relatively modest origin, who nevertheless had the courage to draft the Declaration of the Rights of the Woman and the Citizen, who proclaimed gender equality, was guillotined for being a too radical thinker. Many aristocrats and clergymen lost their political, social, and even economic privileges. The civil constitution of the clergy gave the French government or National Assembly the right to decide who would be licensed priests, Catholic priests, and the state would pay their salaries. There were quite many French clergymen who refused to swear this oath, and then were either imprisoned or defrocked, in other words, dismissed from being priests, in some cases killed, or then exiled, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. While the French Revolution failed to make, for example, the two sexes, men and women, equal, while it definitely failed to radically redistribute property so that many ordinary farmers and workers would have benefited much, nevertheless, it was a step towards the modern constitutional democracy. Unfortunately, much blood was spilled during it, and that could explain partly why Napoleon was able so easily to overthrow the Directorate in November 1799, because so many French people were tired of this decade of disorder and bloodshed, and frequently changing governments, sometimes rigged elections. They wanted order and stability so they could return to that partly mythical good old days time when they could busy themselves with making a living without having to bother about political or other ideologies. From a Christian viewpoint, the French Revolution presented a mixture of good ideals such as freedom of religion and de-establishment of the state church, and then bad ones because so many revolutionaries were either deists or occultists or atheists, and certainly the worship of reason was a very radically anti-Christian idea, and the desecration of many places of worship, although it should of course be noted, and many especially fundamentalist evangelical Pentecostal charismatic Protestants would point out that the French section of the Roman Catholic Church was notably corrupt, with many priests, for example, living in sexual immorality. And then there are many Roman Catholic doctrines, generally accepted doctrines and church practices, which either are clearly against the Bible. For example, the doctrine of papal infallibility or infallibility, although it wasn't officially established until 1870. And then, for example, claiming that partaking of the sacraments by itself could somehow cleanse a person from his or her. Although the Roman Catholic doctrine does state also that a person living under a mortal sin does not benefit from participating in the sacraments. And of course, this principle that supposedly outside the church there's no salvation. And then the sale of indulgences to supposedly rescue people from purgatory, dead people from purgatory. Although, to be fair, many mainline Protestant churches have more or less adopted, with some modifications, Catholic sacramentalism. For example, here in Finland, quite many members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church at least hope to be saved because they have been christened as babies, they have been confirmed as teenagers, they have been good, decent, honest people, diligent people, good church members. They have liked going to church at Easter and Christmas. They have liked to sing nice Christian hymns. They have even been elected to the local parish councils or even to the national conference of the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church. And then some may even base their hope of heaven on serving as priests or other ministers of the church. And then hoping that these kinds of outward religious ceremonies and practices and activities could compensate for that strange born-again experience that evangelicals, fundamentalists, Pentecostals, and charismatics emphasize. But I digress from the topic. Anyway, I hope that this video will give you some ideas on the importance of the Great French Revolution.